folks, can we all take our seats? Can I ask everybody please to take their seats so we can get started on the afternoon session? We only have the COP president till 2, so I want to get started as soon as possible. So if everyone can take their seats. Welcome back, everybody. If you could all just take your seats, we're going to get started. I was thinking about doing an introduction and what I should say in the introduction. And I, of course, have here a 2-page biography of Alok. But the truth is, we've come to know him so well. Folks, can we take a seat ASAP? Thank you. But we've come to know Alok so well, he has become a totemic figure of the highs and lows of COP26. He's continued to, I think he's constantly on the road in his continuous work as COP president. This session is we're going to have some introductory remarks from Alok. Then I'm going to ask him a few questions that have been on our mind. And then I'm going to open it to all of you to get some questions in. If you are here from the press, I'm going to disappoint you because we don't want press questions because we want to save the few questions we have for CBI members. So without further ado, I'm really delighted, in fact honoured as the CBI, to welcome the current sitting, active, knee-deep in it, COP president and our old friend, Alok Sharma.
Tony, thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thank you for the warm welcome, and that includes the temperature in the room. Look, I want to start by thanking the CBI for organising this, I think, incredibly important event. And it's about discussing, of course, how business can lead the transition to net zero. Now, over the last 2 years, the CBI has been kind enough to invite me to speak when I was business secretary and then when I was doing this role as COP president designate. But at that point, we had a virtual audience. So I think it's absolutely wonderful that we are back in person and able to have these sort of discussions literally face to face. And I also want to thank, really a huge thank you to all the corporates who supported COP, particularly our principal sponsors and other supporters who are here today as well. Now, friends, it's just over 6 months since COP26, where working with partners around the world, but under the UK stewardship, nearly 200 countries agreed the historic Glasgow Climate Pact. And that pact forged a path to a clean global future. And it kept alive the possibility of limiting the average rise in global temperatures to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And I want to thank all of you who were there, and many of you I know in this room were there alongside us on the banks of the Clyde. And of course, this was one of the first COPs where we had a huge amount of representation from the business community as well. And I hope that's something that continues at future COPs. So I want to thank you for the commitments that you have made as individual businesses. And of course, for all the work you did to push us as governments to go further. Now, in recent months, the world has changed. The clouds have darkened over the international landscape. And with Putin's illegal and brutal invasion of Ukraine, war has returned to Europe. And the reality is that the tectonic plates within our geopolitics have shifted and continue to shift. We also know that inflation is spiking around the world. We see debt mounting, we see energy prices rising, and globally, people are struggling to feed their families, all as we continue to deal with the effects of the pandemic. So what I would say to you is that in short, and the framing of this conference recognizes this point, we are meeting against the backdrop of a global crisis and geopolitical turmoil. And yet, these current crises should increase, not diminish, our determination to deliver on the commitments that we collectively made in Glasgow. And I would argue that the evidence for action is unequivocal. Many of you will have seen the recent reports that have come out from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the US the UN's intergovernmental body on climate action. And that's made clear that the window of time we have left to act is closing. And frankly, it is closing fast. So inaction or delayed action will create immense additional risks and costs. Now, I know everyone here avidly reads reports put out by the OBR, and you will have seen last year a risk report that they put out, which projected that unchecked climate change could lead to public debt reaching a staggering 289% of GDP by the end of this century. I mean, just think about that. And, you know, just as the science has become starker and the risks have become clearer and the calls to action have grown louder, the opportunities presented by tackling climate change are increasingly evident. And I think the fact that you're all here suggests that you agree with this proposition. Now, I would argue that net zero is one of the clearest economic trends that there has ever been, and it is frankly vast in scope. It encompasses every country, and I think you are representative of this, it encompasses every sector. And it does represent a big economic opportunity. And I see this in the conversations that I have. It is being seized by companies, it's being seized by countries and financial institutions, of course in the United Kingdom, but indeed around the world itself. And each recognizing that net zero is about delivering an economic as well as an environmental dividend. Now, some of you will recall our 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution, which we put out at the end of 2020, and we launched this when I was business secretary. More recently, of course, we've had our net zero strategy and our recent energy security strategy, and all of this together is aimed at mobilizing tens of billions of pounds of private sector investment by 2030 into our economy, and of course supporting hundreds of thousands of green jobs. So that's kind of the domestic pitch, but what you're also seeing around the world, the IEA, the International Energy Agency, has estimated that about 30 million new workers are needed by 2030 to meet increased demand in the clean economy. And the ILO, the International Labour Organization, has projected that some sectors could see 4 times more jobs created than are lost. So I'm really pleased that the CBI has brought together this group together today to discuss exactly how we pick up the pace on the road to net zero. And my core message to you is actually pretty simple. If we're going to deliver the Glasgow Climate Pact, and if we are to seize the opportunities and avoid the costs I've mentioned, the role of business is going to be absolutely critical. And we need the innovation, the influence, and the energy of the private sector. We need changes across the breadth of our economy. And so we need action from companies to keep up the pressure and encourage action from governments around the world. And frankly, the direction of travel is already clear. So when the UK took on the mantle of organising the COP26 presidency, less than 30% of the global economy was covered by a net zero target. By the time we got to COP26, it was over 90%. And you're seeing this in terms of the commitments made by financial institutions to go to net zero. Here in the UK, 60% of the FTSE 100 companies are now committed to net zero as well. And we are, and I hope you'll agree with me, we are transitioning to a clean, green future with opportunities for those who are on the front foot and risks, I'm afraid, for those who are not. Now, you all recognize this here, and many of you will have signed up the UN's Race to Zero campaign. We had 5,000 international companies committing by COP26 to net zero by 2050 or earlier. Since COP26, that momentum has continued. We've got another 2,000 companies. And this is about not committing to some vague aspiration at some distant point of the future, but to clear science-based transition plans. And, you know, we can go further. We can push with the purchasing investment power that you have to drive change, switching to clean power, swapping polluting vehicles for clean vehicles. And of course, you can work with your trade associations and your supply chains in the UK and overseas to make sustainability part and parcel of doing business. So what I would just say to you is that we need to collectively work together governments and business on the road to COP27 in less than 6 months. And by the time we get there, we're going to have to show that the commitments we made are leading to action. Because the reality is that just as we hold ourselves to account, our populations will do the same, and future generations will ask whether we did indeed collectively rise to the challenge. I have to say to you, friends, we have to for the future of our planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Alok. We're just going to lose the podium. Oh, that was very easy. I thought that was going to be a 10-minute affair. Alok, that's great, and thank you so much for that call to arms. I wanted to ask you a couple of personal questions, if I may. Which is...
Not too personal.
No, not too personal. Don't worry, there's a big crowd here. COP26, as you reflect on it now, as you look back on it now, and I know you probably haven't got time to do this, what are you most proud of, and what are you most disappointed by?
Well, I think sort of what I'm most proud of, I guess, is that we managed to get almost 200 countries to agree to a deal. And I mean, you're all used to negotiations, and you know what it's like trying to do a bilateral negotiation. And this is basically getting almost 200 countries to agree to effectively a global blueprint about how we deal with climate. And those of you who sort of watched this thing unfold, particularly on the last day, will see that it became, quite tricky. And I think there was genuinely a point where I thought 2 years of work by people around the world was going to come to naught. Well, we managed to get this over the line. The key issue, of course, now is on delivery and implementation of the commitments that were achieved.
And it feels to some of us that COPs are big moments where actually you get a sense of delivery and commitment. Presumably, in between COPs, I would imagine it's harder because the forcing device, the world stage, the peer group pressure, the sort of the public eye is less on people. Are you finding that actually there's just a natural dip after a COP to get people to do things?
I think what has happened in the last few months, and I mentioned this in my opening remarks, is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And that has changed the international landscape, and the reality is that is an issue that is now sort of front and center. And by the way, completely rightly, and I just want to make this point, is that we have to stand as an international community with Ukraine. And I don't think anyone can fail to be moved by the harrowing images that we see emerging just about every day. And then on top of that, you've got inflation to deal with, you've got debt, all of those issues that I talked about. But the reality is that the chronic threat of climate change is not going away. And that's why we need to keep pushing on this. And the focus will come back when we get to Sharm el-Sheikh. The front pages will be back on climate. And people will ask the question, we had 120 world leaders. By the way, how many of you attended COP26? How many of you are attending COP27? We want to see a few more hands. If you were at COP26, you'll have seen we had 120 world leaders turned up. They all made really impassioned speeches about why we needed to tackle climate change. And by the time we get to Sharm el-Sheikh, we will have to see some progress. Now, we are pushing on implementation together with our Egyptian colleagues. I held a meeting together with Sami Shukri, the foreign minister for Egypt, who is the COP president designate for COP27. We brought together almost 50 governments in Copenhagen a few weeks ago. And so, we are seeing progress. But if you ask me where we are in terms of scorecard, I would say we've made some progress, but actually there's a lot more to do over the next 5 months, and we need to go a lot faster.
Can I ask, therefore, on the way to Egypt, so we've been talking a lot this morning about how the sort of discontinuity of Russia-Ukraine has changed the nature of the net zero debate, how it's changed it for consumers facing cost of living, how it's changed it for companies in terms of investment capability and so on. Does it substantively change the roadmap of things you would have wanted to do between 26 and 27? Will 27 look different because of Russia-Ukraine?
Well, 27, I think a lot of it is going to be all about implementation. So we got lots of agreements over the line at COP. You know, we closed off the Paris rule book. Lots of people told me that we wouldn't be able to do that. You know, we got agreement on more finance to support developing nations. We got agreement on what we need to do in terms of adapting to climate change. All of this was agreed. What now needs to happen is implementation. And one of the big things that we did get over the line, which again I think lots of people were skeptical whether we would get over the line, is an agreement that absolutely every single country would look again at their 2030 emission reduction target by the end of this year and you know, look to improve it if they were not aligned with the Paris temperature goals. Now, normally this cycle takes place every 5 years. You know, the proof of the pudding will be in whether countries do come forward. So I think that's one of the sort of big things we will look for at COP27. But I think the other sort of issue is that Egypt will, I hope, soon announce some of the other sort of big areas that they want to discuss and debate at COP26. And you know, clearly, energy security, food security, water securities, all of these issues will come to the fore. And I think it's an important point to make is that if you look at the risks that the world faces right now, so whether it's risks from water security or food security or migration risk, all of this is exacerbated by climate change. And we have to look in that context. I mean, you know, we talked a little bit about, in my remarks about, you know, energy. I mean, the reality is, I think governments have now come to understand that climate and environmental security are absolutely synonymous with energy and national security.
Yeah. There is a little bit in the build-up to COP27, in as much as it's got started, there's a little bit of tension I've spotted between developing world and developed world. Is that right? Am I right, or am I over-interpreting? What do you think, as we go into Egypt, are going to be the really big issues?
So I think, you know, I mean, take finance as a big issue. The reality is that unless we're able to support developing nations with finance, a lot of the commitments that they've made are going to be very, very difficult to achieve. One of the things that we did get over the line was a commitment to double the amount of money that goes towards helping countries adapt to the changing climate. That's a big issue. We also, by the way, at COP26 announced $8.5 billion package, well, financing at least at this stage, to support South Africa with a just energy transition partnership. We're looking to do that and hopefully announce by COP27 some more of those for a number of other developing economies as well. And I think the other sort of big issue that you saw debated at COP26 and will come again to the fore at COP27 is this issue of loss and damage. And there are differing views on how you deal with this particular issue. But what we did manage to do at COP26 is basically start a program of work. And in fact, I'm off to Bonn tomorrow, where some of the sort of technical work is starting on this work program. And I think that will be another debate. But overall, I think it is incumbent on developed nations to support developing countries, make those clean energy transitions, to invest in climate resilient infrastructure, and actually the private sector. I mean, can I ask you, how many representatives of the financial services sector are here? Very good. May I ask you, have you signed up to GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero? Okay, that's brilliant. So we've got some nods. So basically, at COP26, we had $130 trillion of assets, financial assets, committing to net zero by 2050. Now that's great, but actually that doesn't mean anything if you're sitting in a developing country, because what you need is for finance from the private sector to flow. And I think there is a piece of work that needs further work that needs to be done to ensure that we help to sort of de-risk you know, some of the investment issues that the private sector has investing in some economies.
Oh, that's a fresh point. Thank you. I'm going to ask you, putting you all on notice, I'm coming to you in 2 questions time, so save up your questions for Alok. So a couple of questions we've been debating this morning, which are probably more developed world issues. The first one is, the popularity, public popularity in this day and age, by which I mean the last 3 months with the cost of living crisis, for net zero. And it's very hard to untangle. Some opinion polls tell you, no, this is a really big vote winner. Other opinion polls tell you, stay the hell away from this. What is your sense of, either in Britain or more generally around the world, whether or not the public momentum for net zero action has taken a hit because of Russia, Ukraine, and the cost of living crisis?
So I think there was a very interesting piece of analysis done by an outfit called Carbon Brief, and they sort of focus, as the name suggests, on sort of climate issues. And they did an analysis some months ago of where were right-leaning papers in the UK on this particular issue. So they looked at editorials back in 2011. And at that point, if you look at right-leaning newspapers, their analysis was that for every one positive editorial on climate action, there were 5 against. You fast forward to 2021, it was 9 in favour, 9 editorials in favour of climate action, as opposed to sort of 1 against. So, I would argue that actually climate has gone from being a sort of fringe issue to really being sort of mainstream. And it's not just environmental correspondents writing about this. You've got energy correspondents, business correspondents, fashion correspondents writing about this issue. It is up there. Now, you're right that actually for very many people in our country and other parts of the world, the cost of living issue is front and centre. But what's been quite interesting is if you see some of the opinion polling that has come out recently, whilst that is up there, climate, environmental issues still feature as one of the top 3 issues that people are concerned with. So, I would argue that actually this is something that is here with us to stay. The general public recognises it. And for me, what's been particularly interesting over this almost 3-year period of focusing on COP26 is that I think we've got to that inflection point where governments, business, and civil society are largely singing from the same hymn sheet in terms of the need for change.
Yeah, good. Final question from me. Business. Here they stand before you. Actually, they
sit.
Yeah, well, there is some standing room only at the moment. So be honest. What have we done well and what have we not yet done and we deserve a bit of a telling off for?
Well, I try not to tell people off. It sort of stops them doing the things I want them to do. Look, I think what has business done well? So I think at COP26, as I said, I think it's the first time we saw this sort of big mass of the business community internationally coming together and making big commitments. And as I said, we've got 7,000 international businesses signed up to the Race to Zero campaign. I think what needs to happen next, obviously we need more of these, more companies to sign up to commitments to net zero. But what we really need to see is those detailed transition plans coming together. Just as I say to countries, it's great that we've now got 90% of the global economy covered by a net zero target, but unless you're going to meet your short-term objectives in terms of cutting emissions, the long term becomes sort of really a little bit sort of meaningless. And so what we need is for all of you to set out detailed transition plans on how you're going to get sort of there near term and work with your suppliers. And the final thing I would just say is that, one thing I have noticed, and last year, Tony, I went to almost 40 countries in about a 9-month period, and I can tell you it was quite something traveling during COVID, and I've continued to travel. But when I've gone, I've met not just businesses, but I've also, not just governments, but also businesses and civil society. And there are countries I can point at, I won't mention them here, but there are countries I can point at where even over that sort of 2-3 year period we've been doing this work, you've seen the business community pulling governments forward with commitments. And that is great. So if you are an international business, then please do that in all the jurisdictions that you are based.
Yeah. Good. I think that's a good challenge. Right, let's get some questions in. We have at the front here. Well, actually, I'll let the question holders. We're going to try and take 2 at a time. Okay, so I'm going to start with, I don't even know where number 1 is, so I'm going to start with number 2. Right, sorry, you've got a number.
Hi, how are you? Megan Maguire, Skanska UK. First and foremost, really enjoyed watching COP26 as a young professional. It was really passion, driving and having business engaged. Definitely second everything you said. One thing that I made a note of my COP26 notes was about Rishi Sunak's agreement for public listing of financial institutions and listed plans on how they will transition to net zero 2023. Thought that was the first kind of agreement we have to publicise what we're doing and how we're planning to get there. My 2 sub-questions are, 1, can you give a 6-monthly update of how that's going, because 2023 is quite soon? And secondly, are we looking to expand beyond financial and into probably a number of different industries that are sat here today? Because I think that will ultimately drive, transition by showing how they're planning to get there. Thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. We're going to take one more.
Chris Dodwell from Impacts Asset Management. So, sorry, it's another one, a request for an update. I guess you've mobilised the business and investment community now at COP26. One of the things I had from my investment team, which was asking me this week, was what's going to happen in Bonn? And I wonder whether...
so in Bonn?
Yeah, in the negotiations that are happening this week. So this is the official level negotiations, which tend to be not quite as successful sometimes as the ministerial-led delegation. So are you able to kind of keep momentum up in terms of countries' progress between the COPs? Because I think if we had some more reassurance about that, we wouldn't go looking for stories. And when you start to go looking for stories coming out of these events, they tend to be someone kind of blocking a particular area. So what can the COP president do to kind of share more of the good news stories around what's happening since Glasgow?
Okay. Right. Two great questions. So firstly, I think in terms of transition plans, yes, I think that was a great announcement from the Chancellor. You'll have noticed that in the last few weeks he's also announced the task force, the transition task force that has been set up as well. And I think your question of which sectors this cover, I mean, that I guess is a question really for the Treasury. What I don't want to do is to speak on behalf of Rishi here, but I think I go back to this more general point that I made, which is that actually what we want to see is transition plans from all companies who are making net zero commitments. You don't have to wait for the UK government to tell you, this is what we require. I mean, this is something that should be happening anyway. Can I ask you, how many companies are currently working on transition plans? Very good. Excellent. Maybe next year we can get...
Publish them.
Feedback. Okay, so that's the first one. The second point on progress, I think that's a very good point. So, yes, the discussions in Bonn at official level have started. There's an enormous amount of sort of technical work that goes into these negotiations, as you know, and therefore what is kind of left for the politicians is the political agreement on this. And it's the same thing that happened in the lead up to COP26 as well. In terms of the progress that we've made, since COP26 we've had 11 countries that have come forward with their sort of revised 2030 emission reduction targets. I can tell you from the discussions we had in Copenhagen, there are a lot of other countries looking at this issue as well. And I think in terms of finance, we've agreed that just as last year ahead of COP26, we had the German and Canadian governments putting together a delivery plan on finance to support developing nations. There will be an update again ahead of COP27. But maybe we should find another way of amplifying some of the messaging as well.
And Helen Watley is going to be here from the Treasury tomorrow, and we've just had permission from the COP president to ask her lots of tough questions. So I'm sure she's not looking forward to tomorrow.
Go for it.
Let's do one more question. He actually said go for it. Okay, we really did have license. I was giving you a chance to cop out there. Right, let's do one more question.
Hello. Yes. Thank you for your insights. I think they're very useful. My question...
Can you just say your name?
Yes.
All that stuff.
Roshan Bujihawan, University of Birmingham. I mean, these are inevitably difficult times for all of us, including businesses. And having clever transition plans means that making necessary compromises between sustainability goals and also cost efficiencies. And this inevitably puts further pressures down on value chains, namely global value chains. What are your views in terms of how businesses, governments, and societies can work together in enabling more responsible global value chains and sort of limit the pressures that currently running across the world in different countries that you're talking about in terms of putting further pressures in the value chains, encouraging modern slavery and so on and so forth?
Okay. Well, let me give you a very specific example. So one of the commitments that we had over 140 countries sign up to was to reverse and then sort of end deforestation by 2030, start reforestation. And that commitment from over 140 countries covers over 90% of the forests in the world. So, I mean, that's a great commitment. But if I say on the other side is that there are various estimates out there which suggest that 70–80% of forest loss takes place because of commodities being grown. So whether it's to do with meat production or soy or palm oil. 80% of deforestation is because these are not done in a sustainable way. So there is a piece of work that we are doing, working with producer countries as well as supplier countries on this issue in terms of how do you tackle and arrest deforestation at the same time ensure that you have sustainable methods of growth of commodities and supply of commodities. So there is work that is ongoing, and the reality is that if you can deliver that, if you can ensure that you have a sustainable way of delivering these commodities, growing them, actually the good news is that you're also going to deliver at the same time for the climate as a result of not having that same level of deforestation. And there are a number of countries that have signed up. Brazil, for instance, has signed up to annual targets for reducing deforestation rates. And so hopefully that gives you an example. I mean, since we talk very specifically about supply chains, that gives you one example of where there is a lot of work still ongoing.
Alok, very quick last question. What's the next big milestone for you between now and Sharm el-Sheikh?
So I think there are a number of milestones, I can put it like that. We've got, what we did last year was to work through the big international events, so whether it was the G7, the G20, the UN General Assembly, to try and push countries to deliver on their commitments. We've got CHOGM, the Commonwealth Heads Government meeting coming up in a few weeks. We've just had the G7 Climate, Energy, Environment Ministers meeting, and actually at that we got a commitment from the G7 to phase out coal and also to end international fossil fuel finance by the end of 2022. So what we want to do is to use those big moments, CHOGM, the UN General Assembly in the autumn, and then the G20 as well, to drive forward progress as we get to COP27. And I just end with this really, Tony, which is that there was I think we generated a lot of hope and positivity coming out of COP26, and I think people saw that the multilateral system, whilst it's pretty unwieldy, on this issue at least, was working. What I think is going to be really important, and I think this is actually down to world leaders because it is really on them, is to ensure that we maintain that hope and that positivity at COP27. And that's why it's going to be so important that countries deliver on the commitments that they made at COP26.
We could have done this for hours. And it's just amazing to me that all of us sort of, left COP and we went about our business and have been distracted by everything else, but you have been clearly grasping, pushing forward, making progress. We wish you every success for the rest of the presidency, and we're really honoured that you could be with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, Alok Sharma.
Tony, Alok, thank you. That was tremendous. Right, we have 2 for the price of 1 coming up now. A small handful of you have a blue dot on your badge, and I think you have opted into one of the breakout sessions we're running in a moment. Coordination of key industries in the race to net zero. If you'd make your way downstairs to the Smith Centre, we'll be up and running with that very shortly. For the majority of you here in the room, I said we were going to get a little bit tougher as the day went on, and we're about to tackle some of the really tricky stuff now. This next session, too hard to decarb, net zero for heavy industry. We know that heavy industry represents something like 1/6 of the UK's total emissions and comprises some of the UK's most energy-intensive businesses. We've got sectors like steel and chemicals that are just at the heart of our supply chains. And at the same time, we've got energy costs for those sectors really soaring. So what are those major challenges they're facing? And what is the role of new technology in supporting the transition for heavy industry? To steer us through that, I'm going to welcome up here Tom Thackeray, our Programme Director for Decarbonisation and the brains behind today, along with the team. And joining Tom, we've got 4 business leaders. Seamus French from Laing O'Rourke, Dave Dalton from British Glass, Isabel Maddock from James Cropper, and Christopher from Mott MacDonald. If you'd all join me up here on the stage, we'll get going with the next session. Thank you very much.
Take a seat. Yeah. Well, sustainable. Sure. Yeah. Hey, I'm not in the middle. While we rearrange the furniture. So as Matthew set out there, industrial emissions comprise a hefty chunk of the UK's overall emissions profile. But unlike some parts of the economy, it's often regarded as a sector which is one of the hardest to decarbonise. Where there are lower carbon technologies, often they are quite immature and potentially more expensive than sort of tried and tested methods of production. And not competitive unless there is some form of intervention, either regulatory or fiscal. But these sectors lie at the heart of our supply chains. They're really important to our economy. They lie at the heart of supply chains like food and drink, health, and right across the economy. So it's really important that we don't lose out production capacity to overseas competitors in the years ahead. So how are industrial sectors going to play their part on the road to net zero? Well, delighted to have the panel with me to enter into some of those questions. And I'm going to go to Dave Dalton from British Glass first, if I may. So perhaps you just give us a sense from the glass industry. How far is the glass industry along in terms of the decarbonisation pathway? And what are the major challenges, do you think, in terms of decarbonisation of that sector?
Thank you, Tom. How far? Very difficult to measure. It's sort of moving goalposts. We set off on this journey back in 2014 in terms of putting roadmaps together. We obviously revised those in the light of net zero. We've made significant progress in my life in the glass industry. We've moved from 3 million tonne carbon emission to 1.5, but it's still a long way from where we aspire to be. Again, terms like net zero, I made an argument, it must be almost 10 years ago in Brussels to the Commission, that the glass industry could already prove itself to be better than net zero. The products we produce have, during their working lifetime, a 10 times greater impact on reducing carbon than the whole of glass manufacture across Europe. But for me, that's not good enough. We need to take it out completely. So I think there are spurious measures out there. In terms of measuring where we are, as I've said, it's moving goalposts. We keep getting interruptions in that journey. As Alok's just outlined, we find ourselves in a global crisis. There's a war in mainland Europe. Energy prices are soaring, and not just kicked off by the war. These were around from October when the policies in place really didn't actually function. We found by October that prices were 4 or 5 times what they should have been. And I think that set panic into the system. So in terms of the plans, companies in my sector, for instance, have changed a lot of the things they were doing proactively to decarbonise to prop the business up. If you've got a bottom line, for instance, in glass manufacture, historically around 20 to 25% of product price, ex-gate, is invested in fuel. With a 5 times price increase, it costs more to fuel than it does to actually manufacture, than you can sell the product for. So obviously all the plans put in place to decarbonise, and we were doing very strong things there. We've run trials at zero carbon production of glass bottles. We demonstrated that at COP26 in the Green Zone with a large stand with Cabinet Office to show that with the right support from government, it is entirely possible to get further on that journey. But I wouldn't like to put a marker in the sand as to where we are, but what I would like to say is, picking up from some of the things that were said by Alok just there, we need a better dialogue with government. It's not through civil servants. That is ostensibly very good. It's at ministerial level where this dialogue needs to cease being so adversarial. I also sort of take slight issue with some of the titles of today. Heavy industry. It almost sets the agenda that we're the bad guys. You know, we've got problems. I think we've come a long way on that journey. We are energy intensive, there's no doubt about it, but we're on a journey to completely decarbonise. So I think better terminology will help a better dialogue. I think it's really important we get the dialogue correct before we can work together. Another thing that was said in the previous speech, industry can lead this probably more effectively than government can. Governments around the world need to be backing industry and supporting these plans to put net zero in place rather than fighting. It's all about trying to achieve a harmonious path to net zero rather than having a Pyrrhic victory where someone eventually says, I won.
Thanks, Dave. Seamus, can I bring you in now? Laing O'Rourke obviously is part of a construction supply chain and has a big range of suppliers who are developing sort of industrial products and things like that. How are you working with your supply chain? What's your story in terms of decarbonisation of your business and the influence you can have in the sort of the broader sphere?
It's very warm here, isn't it? Is that deliberate, do you think? Is that the taste of things to come?
Yeah, we're struggling with rising temperatures.
Yeah. Look, I don't think that's really the critical question, to be very honest. But let me just explain that. So I listened to Alok. He talked about the IEA in Paris. I was there last year. And I saw the US pathway to net zero, and I've seen a few more since. All the pathways to net zero look exactly the same because the solutions are the same. They're all about nuclear, they're about hydrogen, they're about renewables, and they're about carbon capture and storage, ammonia for trains, etc., etc. That's all we have. But what really struck me is that the construction industry has to build that new world. Everything has to be constructed. 8 nuclear power stations here in the UK, renewable stations, wind farms, etc., etc. So the real question is the construction industry ready to ramp up to the level of intensity and with the speed that's required, as Alok talked about, to achieve the pathway to net zero that everybody demands? And the answer is it's not. And the reason why it isn't is because we will not have the people we need to build on the scale that's required to achieve net zero. If the UK is to build 8 nuclear power stations, it will need over 150 people trained in nuclear construction. They don't exist. They don't even exist today for Hinkley, and we are bringing in Romanian, Albanian, Bulgarian steel fixers and concrete pourers because they're not available here in the UK. So the industry has to move to a much, much, much higher productivity level by moving all the construction activity off-site away from projects into factories. That's the model we're looking at. We want to build all the components for all our major projects in factories using factory productivity and automation techniques, bring them on site and assemble them on site with only a fraction of the workforce we have today. And the second is digital. All construction projects in the future will have to be digitally delivered from design right through to the assurance closeout. And I think the building safety bill here in the UK actually will trigger that in the residential and commercial industries. But the second is, and Alok mentioned this again, collaboration. What's missing right now is collaboration. Collaboration between clients, designers, and the constructors. And whether that's in the public sector or private sector, our clients generally are not demanding from us low carbon solutions, with the exception of a few, Derwent, Stanhope, The Edge, who are doing great work in that space. And I particularly look at the public sector. The public sector works are not demanding low carbon solutions. And government procurement processes are mechanistic, cumbersome, clunky, bureaucratic. They're not streamlined, and they're not delivering low carbon solutions because no value is placed by the public sector procurement process on low carbon solutions. And the government produced a fantastic UK construction playbook in 2020, which we totally agree with. It's just not been implemented. And that is slowing down the implementation, the innovation of low carbon solutions, particularly in public sector works. And if I'd one plea, it would be to clients and to the public sector particularly, please demand from us low carbon solutions and value those low carbon solutions in the fee formula which you have for the industry. And the industry makes, I mean, I come from outside construction, so I speak with the glass, bright-eyed enthusiasm of somebody who's new to the industry. The operating net profit margin is 2.5%. An industry cannot reinvent itself, invest in digital off-site manufacturing technologies with operating profit margins 2.5%. So the fee structure has to change away from a lowest possible cost, which drives a race to the bottom, to a fixed percent fee, fixed percent overhead coverage, and then 2 to 5% of incentives around delivery of low carbon solutions. You know, that is the level of transformation, but I'm very, very, very concerned at the rate of progress and the rate of change, particularly, as I say, from a client and designer side. I'd really like to see that collaboration, that holy alliance of client, designer, constructor, working together at a very early stage of design to develop and deliver low carbon. They exist, the solutions are there, but it's quite frustrating to try to introduce into projects where the only incentive, the only motivation is lowest possible cost. It's not going to work.
Interesting. We're going to come back to that demand question, I think, in a moment. Isabel, we're going to bring you in.
That's really, really interesting about that demand pull, because I mean, our experience in paper and packaging is very, very different. You know, there is such a demand for sustainable green products, and you know, the industry is, in terms of where we are on our roadmap, we're actually fairly clear what we want to achieve. As an industry, the paper and packaging industry has set 2035 as achieving net zero. And certainly in James Cropper, which is just a very bespoke manufacturer, we've set 2030 to do that. Now, we've been looking at this for 4 years, mainly because we you know, our customers are demanding sustainable products made in a very sustainable way, and it's really, really important to do that and to achieve it. So that demand really does drive innovation, it drives R&D, and it drives change. And we're just about on a point now where we're about to embark on our first scale up of what we think is a technical solution, looking at 25% of our plant and testing it at economic scale. And I think that's one of the things that the industry is, what's really interesting is we know we want to get there for 2035 as a whole, industry average. 60% of that is going to be innovation led. And the innovation is very much in its raw state. So it's, you know, it's not been tested at economic scale, and it really is about designing your energy systems and your plant and your recycling plants around a completely different energy source than what you currently have in place today. And so there's the technological challenge of doing that, but there's the raw investment that's needed to put that in as well. And those are two challenges, as well as understanding what is the future of green energy. Is it going to be green electricity? Is it going to be green hydrogen? You know, knowing your energy source to make that choice for the roadmap is very important. And one of the challenges we have today is on our existing plant. If, you know, a power plant, we were just talking about this earlier, weren't we? A power plant is massive. It's actually a conglomerate of a whole host of things. You know, you've got skids and turbines and boilers. And if you're choosing to replace a part of that today, you actually want to replace it with something that is going to be viable in the new system in 15 years' time. You don't want to be left with stranded assets. So being clear about what's happening in the UK and whether green electricity can really be brought to our sites, or green hydrogen, is massively important today, because it will help us make those investment decisions.
So is it a local infrastructure decision that's going to enable that? So is it grid connectivity or hydrogen power?
Exactly, the connectivity to the grid, you know, whether it's our investment or whether it's the grid's investment to get there, but we're going to have a different pull on demand for power than is currently available to the sites today.
It's good,
point, I think it's important to understand the bigger integrated energy, integrated infrastructure problem that we face from front to end, and we need to look at the development pathway that we need to follow, set tangible targets that we can actively strive towards and actually meet. And those need to be measurable targets that can be executed through collective collaboration, not just with industry, but with government as well, So we all need to come together to focus on these targets, and that development pathway, focusing on the integrated nature of the problem, needs to be set. And that's one of the challenges that's being looked at. And various organizations, both independent and government-led, nationally and internationally, have tried to set out what these archetypes might look like for future energy and infrastructure systems, and how we might have to work our way towards that, because there needs to be a transition. We can't immediately switch something off and switch something on. The complexity of the problem is something that needs to be understood, and that transition pathway then needs to be set out and followed. And innovation is going to drive this. And I should mention there are various technologies that have been under development for many, many years. There's a lot of knowledge in industry that we now need to harness and bring to the forefront and extend. And that knowledge base needs to be harnessed, and we need the support from governments and from the private sector and the public sector to push this forward and basically set out towards achieving the goals across the value chain as far as an integrated energy system and integrated infrastructure system is concerned.
And you particularly focus on hydrogen, Chris, is that right? So what's the sort of potential for hydrogen in the industrial sector for decarbonisation, would you say? And
it's a good question. That's something that's still under investigation. I think we do get asked that question on a number of occasions by various different organisations and individuals. It's got a lot of potential, but I should mention hydrogen has been with us for many, many decades in heavy industry. We use it as a chemical feedstock, so we need to leverage that capability, that knowledge base and technology, and extend it into these new sectors that we're exploring. So not just industry, and there's different categorization for industry, light industry, heavy industry, manufacturing, across the supply chain. But when looking at the wider integrated infrastructure problem we face, we then need to try and establish to what extent we need to develop systems and develop infrastructure that can facilitate and harness not just our existing infrastructure base, but to work towards the goals that we've set and not end up with stranded assets, as was mentioned. So these archetypes become very important. And as part of that process, we need to establish to what extent hydrogen or variations thereof, synthetic liquids or sustainable fuels can play a role. We need to establish to what extent raw power electricity will play a role, to what extent we need to bring new systems online, green renewable power production, nuclear power, to what extent will that play a role? Because we have to be conscious of the fact that the system needs to be stable. We need to provide a resilient, secure supply to the offtake base, and the consumer will want that reassurance, not just from government but from industry.
And pricing
and
as well.
Pricing is very important.
Pricing.
So we need to develop this in such a way, and that it comes back to this pathway that we set up, this trajectory that we embark upon, the roadmaps that we develop, not independently as in organizations, but also collectively, nationally, and how everything ties in. Once again, coming back to this integrated infrastructure problem that we face, and how we deal with the problem from start to finish across the supply chain, because we have to be conscious that everything that we use, from the shoes that we wear every day, it uses hydrocarbons. It comes from raw materials that we mine and that we source. We need to come up with new systems, new solutions that transitions away from or redevelops the methods that we capture those raw materials and repurpose them and work and develop them into the final products that we use today. And as part of that process, we're trying to establish to what extent hydrogen can play a role. And in industry, there are tangible targets that have been set already. There's been a lot of movement. If we look at, for example, the industrial clusters, the East Coast clusters, as well as the Northwest cluster, there's a lot of development taking place, and clear roadmaps have been set out with proper projects that have been outlined and tangible targets that have been set that clearly sets out to what extent hydrogen can play a role in the short term, and how we can work our way towards a longer term trajectory to hit the strategic targets.
I think we're going to have to be a lot smarter too with integrated solutions, and I think the combination, for example, of solar renewable plus water equals hydrogen is going to be absolutely critical. Unfortunately, the UK in terms of solar is not going to be particularly advantaged, but I think countries like Australia, I would very confidently expect Australia to be a net exporter of hydrogen the next decade. Huge potential for generation of hydrogen, very cheap. Solar power plus water equals hydrogen, export facilities, east and west coast Australia. And I think the same with things like carbon capture and storage. What I can see are integrated generating centres of carbon and integrated users of that carbon. So, industrial scale solutions where there's a collective generation of carbon dioxide into a system. And the trick with carbon capture and storage is not the storage, it's utilization. So wherever we can, create mass kind of capture of carbon dioxide and mass utilization of the carbon dioxide, which really means industrial centers, that's smarter integrated solution. But again, we keep coming back to the same thing. It's collaboration. No single, unit, no single company is going to be able to do that. There is going to be a much, 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 much greater need for collaboration in terms of the big solutions in decarbonisation.
Yeah, can I ask a question about the scale of that collaboration? Who's driving that? Is that a central government thing to convene? Is it something for the new future systems
I think central government needs to play a much more active role in that. I'm not just representing Glass here. I also wear the hat of the chair of the energy, the EIUG, the Energy Intensive Industries User Group, which is the sort of main dialogue with government for industries such as steel and glass, ceramics, cement, paper, etc. The dialogue is too disparate. It doesn't actually help that we don't have any flesh on the future fuel strategy. It doesn't help that we, as Isabel said, we're working towards change, but we've no idea what that change ultimately looks like. So to deliver that, we've got to sort of break in our business plans and our roadmaps until we know where it's going. So we need much better joined up thinking within different government departments. We need Treasury on board, understanding that industries with these sorts of problems are going to need support through these processes, not caps on what they can do. And that is critically important. I've just, in terms of dialogue, intra-government dialogue, been appalled by watching the emergence of the fuel crisis and seen Treasury take a completely different stance to the rest of government. We have a plan to take us out of COVID. We can't cope with putting anything more into the financial strategy here. There's a limit. And then basically lies come back from that, because the denial by government that there is a limit is really an important part of understanding just who's encapsulated by the emerging legislation. All of the ability to recoup and recover the carbon taxes that we all pay is critically dependent on an understanding that the burden that they provide and how much of that actually just goes back to the exchequer and is deployed elsewhere rather than in these industry sectors. So we need that linkage within government, and we need to be clear on where that's going, how it's employed, and how we can then plan from there forward. Because without that, we're just floundering in the dark.
I can see we're storing up the questions for our Treasury Minister coming into to the session tomorrow. Moving us on, and you mentioned, Dave, actually, in your opening comments around the impact of the current energy cost crisis and what that means for net zero plans. Perhaps you can just add a bit of colour to that. What's the scale of the impact, and have plans been paused or pushed to the right? How does it work?
Enormous. I started a challenge back in 2012 with government to actually build a transition centre, knowing that this sort of thing was going to come, looking at what we as an industry could do, not just to decarbonise, but also to improve our productivity and our international competitiveness. And fundamentally, 2012 I put a bid in for that, and there is now a plant being built out in St Helens that will demonstrate that. There's about 55 million pounds worth of funding, some of which is from government, some of which is from businesses and industry, and some of it from the supply chain, because it's about engagement with the supply chain, understanding how we move all of this forward. So what's happened in there is the companies that have moved forward and started to engage with that process have seen that their bottom lines are being absolutely decimated. There's zero ability to pass through anything more than about 30% in a fuel crisis. So once you get to that limit, what do you do next? You see material switching. We're seeing, because of the relaxation of the border tariffs that after coming under Brexit, it's easier for Britain to trade with the rest of the world if we have more liberal border tariffs. We're seeing simple things like container glass, a jam jar, for instance, which used to sell for about 9 or 10p. How can that make its way from Turkey or Egypt or even China to the UK shores and sell commercially? Because they don't have the same issues in terms of paying environmental taxes as we do. Now, I agree we have to pay them, but the problem is when fuel prices go up, and that actually completely mitigates any profit, in fact threatens survival full carbon migration, companies closing down, jobs lost, all that manufacture going elsewhere in the world because the demand won't go away. So what we've seen is a lot of that investment is being focused on propping up the bottom line, and it's been taken completely away. We were doing hydrogen trials, biofuel trials, all on hold.
I totally agree with that. I think the impact on the industry, certainly in construction, has been pronounced, but it's exacerbated by the pricing, the contractual formula. Fixed price contracts, as you say, none of that passes through, and all it does is erode the profits necessary for investment, technology change, etc., etc. But again, we've had almost a perfect storm of events here in the UK over the last 10 years, right? Brexit, COVID, the Ukraine, all of which have impacted on all those essentials in the supply chain for the industry. And so if we project that going forward, it is impossible to guarantee any security or guarantee of outcomes of profitability operating with fixed price formulas in that sort of uncertain environment. Is there any guarantee that uncertainty will change? Absolutely not. The only guarantee is it'll continue. And there will be something else in the next, there'll be a trifecta of events in the next 10 years. So, again, we have to move away to more collaborative style arrangements. And again, I'll keep coming back to the word collaboration. The speed that Alok talked about, the rate of change, the innovation will only be achieved by collaboration. And that goes through every facet of how we do business, starting with how we reward and how we construct, how we work together, et cetera, et cetera. And I think a lot of our practices are just simply outdated and won't survive into the future.
Interesting. Isabel, how about the impact on James Cropper of the energy cost crisis?
Well, I can only agree. We've had, really difficult few years with COVID and now the energy crisis and Brexit before that. And I mean, the plain fact is decarbonisation is a lot easier if you're performing well. Businesses need to perform in order to be able to invest. And when that performance is taking a real dive and you've had 2 or 3 years of hard performance, your choice to invest might be more to actually bring that performance back up to a good level before you can then choose to decarbonise. So it may have stalled some of the decisions, some of the very hard decisions businesses now have to make. Doesn't mean not now, it does, it means not now, possibly.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the demand side, which has been mentioned a few times, and I think, Seamus, you mentioned that your clients aren't demanding low carbon.
Not enough of them.
Not enough
Some
of them.
are.
Okay. No. And Isabel, you said actually your clients are?
Massively, yes.
Massively. Are they UK-based, private sector businesses?
No, we have a number of businesses, and if we think about the paper and packaging side of the business, there's internationally, clients are asking for 100% recycled content in their papers. Upcycling, just recently we've had a bit of a circular economy project with denim, incorporating denim into clothing bags that are sold for a clothing retailer. So there's some very exciting projects that go on, but they've been going on for years, and our customer base is really driving collaboration because they want to do the right thing, and that of course encourages us to innovate, to produce beautiful products, but and to do it in the most sustainable way we can. And they're working with us. They know we're not net zero today, but they also know that we've put, we're doing it this decade basically, and we've put a lot of innovation behind it. So that helps them to work with us because we are walking the path together.
And they pay a premium for that decarbonisation if the technological cost of the low carbon version is more expensive?
Massive, yeah. To change over, it's really, really big.
And they pay, the customer will pay?
No, well, they're paying for the product, obviously.
It's priced into the product.
Yeah. And Chris, I know that the demand side is often sort of mentioned in hydrogen production as one of the uncertainties there. If we produce it, who's going to take it? Kind of questions. Is that a worry that you see in industry in terms of the scaling up of that market?
We have seen it in the past, but now with the commitments that have been made, I think we're slowly overcoming that barrier. And many of the incentives and financial mechanisms that have been put in place by government, it's slowly getting there, to be quite honest. I mean, if we look at the Net Zero Hydrogen Fund, that's £214 million. There's the Hydrogen Business Model Fund that's being opened up. That allows organizations to tap into this at relatively small scale still, to be honest, to start rolling these systems out. I think the benefit of that is we get learnings from it, and the industry allows the industry to evolve, because we have to start rolling out and getting scale. Scale is the key, because scale allows for cost reduction. And once you've got scale in place, then automatically the rest of the supply chain will evolve. The demand will come online. And what we've seen in various projects that we've been involved in, there's already a drive for hydrogen demand, as well as sustainable product demand, sustainable fuels that's produced from hydrogen. So the demand is slowly picking up because it forms part of many industrial organizations' roadmaps. So the question becomes, how do we get the supply side to come online? How do we get the infrastructure ready? And that's where these financial mechanisms need to come into place. And once again, we need the public and private sector to work together on this. And eventually, a policy decision will have to be made policy decisions will have to be made with respect to wider infrastructure. For example, in the UK, we're very fortunate. We've got one of the most well-developed gas infrastructure systems in the world. How do we leverage that? At some point, we have to consider the fact that we might have to switch from natural gas to something else. We're still evaluating the potential of that being hydrogen or a variation thereof. What impacts will that have on the system? How do we change? How do we switch? And then how do we link that up with the rest of the industry, both at the front end of the value chain as well as the back end, meaning heavy industry can then connect up to these pipelines and use hydrogen directly as an off-taker. But once again, it comes down to specific decisions that have to be made, and it needs to be driven, or ultimately the policy decisions can only be made by central government, and that's where the ongoing dialogue and collective collaboration between the public and private sector industry becomes very important, and that needs to be accelerated, in my opinion. With respect to wider deployment of hydrogen, I mean, we're involved in projects globally. I can honestly say that we're now seeing traction at what we refer to as gigawatt level. Gigawatt scale, these are massive systems. Because once again, if you bring those systems online at that scale, the supply chain, meaning the supply chain that develops the technology, starts kicking it up a gear. They scale up. Cost reduction comes into play. So the early high costs that need to be carried through some form of subsidy or some carbon cost mechanism will then slowly be displaced by a product that becomes competitive in the market. Although we have to recognize the fact that carbon neutral or net zero solutions will always have a higher cost than the raw or its counterparts, its hydrocarbon counterparts, purely based on the nature of the problem that we're facing. So it becomes consumer-driven in many ways, but the problem will not be solved purely based on consumer-driven models. There needs to be some policy mechanisms, policy changes, regulatory changes that need to be made. Yeah. And that can only be enforced and developed through collective collaboration through the public and the private sector. And I do agree in many cases it needs to be driven by the industrial or the private sector in many ways, because that's where the knowledge lies.
I agree with that. I think you're right about pricing. And we do expect an industry to pay a green premium. We do know that a green source of energy is going to be more expensive than fossil fuel today. We know that. But it still has to be economically viable. And we know hydrogen's really expensive to make. But being able to predict what the pricing might be for hydrogen in 10, 15 years' time when it comes on stream, when we're able to manufacture it in the UK, store it in the UK, distribute it in the UK, having some indication of those price points help us with the timing of when we're going to transition.
I'm going to ask one more question, then I'm going to open up to the audience. The international dimension of this, we hear a lot about sort of carbon leakage, UK forging a course, being really ambitious. How acute is the risk of those industries being offshored if we go too fast and we don't have the necessary protections in there? And what kind of protections could we think about starting to put in place?
I think it's very real. We're actually feeling that already, and long before the fuel crisis. The idea that we can manufacture with all of the inherent burden within the cost of using heavy fuels, or fossil fuels rather, is something that even when you look into mainland Europe, let alone further afield, there's more support for those industries in transition than there is here in the UK. And we need some help across that. I don't think anyone's realised the enormity of the transition problem and the scale and the time frame involved in it. I mean, for instance, in glass manufacture, a furnace will typically be built maybe 400-500 tonnes per day, up to 1,000 tonnes per day in capacity. But the investment in that means that will be cosseted and last for maybe 20 years. If someone is making a change to fuel policy during that time, you've got a massive, the single biggest investment in your business, as suddenly you've just rebuilt it, you've got 18 years to write down, and it's not going to be a viable proposition. So we need a lot more support. And while this is happening, you're actually already seeing, because of what happened with Brexit, countries around the world seeing the UK out of Europe, out of the defence mechanisms for trade barriers, are already testing the marketplace here. I've worked very closely with DIT on trying to put some trade barriers in place to help companies that will be exposed, but they are still very much in trial.
I've been astonished going around projects how many of our inputs or raw materials come from outside the UK. And no offense to glass, but specialist glass, I'm told there were only 2 suppliers in the world that could produce the specialist glass we need. One was in Spain and one was in Germany. The one in Spain collapsed, and the only one left in the world was Germany, which I found astonishing. Our cranes, we have 150 cranes at Langerock. Every one of them is built in Germany. And as I went around the projects, just looking at our steel rebar comes from the Ukraine and Russia, perversely. But I've been astonished at how much of our materials come from outside the UK. So I would say we're already in a very precarious position. And if we fall behind in the decarbonization program, which is a global program to all effects, then we are at risk of falling much, much, much further behind, which I think is of great concern.
I would just add to that as well. I think a lot of our companies are part of huge multinational conglomerates. And there's it's unattractive to invest in the UK at the moment. We've got high operating costs, high carbon costs. Trade is really difficult, and there's no clear roadmap at all as to where we're going really with hydrogen or these green energy supply chains. So there's no certainty, and what that means is there's a much higher risk premium when choices are being made as to where to allocate capital and investment. And your sister company in Europe is more likely to get that investment than we are here in the UK.
You need certainty, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm going to open it up to questions from the floor, please. So I can see there's one over to the right here and one at the front, just in front of me here. I'll take both questions at the same time and ask Al to respond.
Grace March, Suncorp Energy. Heat-intensive industrial processes can use highly efficient combined heat and power, but decarbonisation of heat and decarbonisation of power seem to be 2 separate conversations at the moment. How does the panel see CHP supporting net zero?
Thank you. And the second question down here.
Yeah, Andrew Rowell, Institution of Engineering and Technology. Just like to talk about skills. I mean, best will in the world and so on. Have you got the skills in sufficient numbers coming through to enable you to transition to net zero? If not, what can industry do? What can government do? What support do you need?
Thank you. So who'd like to take either one of those questions?
Can I take the second one? So the second one was skills, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think we have, just again speaking construction, we have a diversity problem, we have an inclusion problem, and we have a skills problem. And to change that, we have to change the nature of the work and how it gets done in the industry. And the way to do that is by, again, taking it off, turning a construction site into a factory environment by producing all the materials that then get assembled on the construction site with skilled assembly personnel. I mean, that's the journey we're on, and Langerock has built such a facility up near Sheffield. But just take an example, and at the risk of upsetting everybody, I did once work in a coal mine before I came to construction. But it was a metallurgical coal mine and supplying input to steel, so just to take a bit of sting out of it. When I left, which was in November 2021, we were operating that coal mine from a remote control room on the surface. So the miners were no longer going underground and operating the machines that cut coal. They were sitting with no speck of coal dust on them in a control room, like in a chemical plant, operating the machines by remote. We had changed the whole industry. And perversely and interestingly, 2 of the 4 were females. So suddenly we had a 50% gender sort of representation in the industry from 3% that we had a year ago. But the point I'm making is we changed the nature of the work, and suddenly we were changing the skills mix 2 out of the 4 were university graduates operating as control room operators. We would never have gotten those university graduates underground operating a shearer in an underground coal mine. So the point I'm making is that you have to first change the nature of the work of the industry, how work is done. That allows you to change the skills mix, and suddenly you're recruiting and training up a very different demographic.
Interesting. I'd like to add on to that point. I mean, one of the things we're focusing on quite heavily is transferable skill sets. Because as the industry is evolving, we need to recognize the fact that people are very much adaptable, and by harnessing the skill set and the knowledge base we have, we will be able to collectively work towards a more integrated and, I would say, more sustainable workforce. And in order to leverage that skill set, we kind of need to get people involved and help facilitate the transition in many ways. Because in many cases, you have this reluctance to move, and that reluctance can be overcome through ongoing engagement and facilitating various training programs and different mechanisms that can also be employed, not just through course material or different educational organizations, but at company level, industrial level as well. So that can be harnessed. And then in addition to that, new skill sets will also always come online. We see the workforce evolving, but in addition to that, we also see this kind of the training regime evolving as well. It needs to continue to evolve at educational level in order to facilitate the next generation of technical skills that we need. But in order to kind of facilitate the transition that we need to work towards, the new skills base that we need to develop need to be able to have some level of exposure to that workforce that we have currently that's also making the transition through the transferable skill set that we have. Because let's be honest, in many cases, these technologies that we are dealing with and these systems that we're dealing with and the processes that we deal with are highly complex. And it requires a lot of experience and capability and knowledge in order to make a competent judgment to what extent it can be repurposed, how you would repurpose, and how you would actually then operate the system. Operational knowledge is quite key, and that comes with experience. So it's leveraging the transferable skill sets and transferring those skill sets to the new generation of the workforce that's coming on and becoming available.
Might I chip in with an answer to the first question? It's a difficult one because, as I recall, the only plant in our industry, in glass manufacture, that was sufficient in size to merit a full installation of a CHP was a big flat glass plant back in the early 2000s. It's fraught with issues because it's not as simple as it might appear on paper. Obviously, the heat itself is, if it's generated by fossil fuel, has carryover, has particulate, that needs cleaning up. All sorts of other emissions need to be looked after. And in sorting all of those other environmental problems, very often the actual available heat is diminished. So physically, the one furnace in the UK of, I think, 2,000 tonnes per day was capable of taking a CHP. It had one. The company bought it themselves, fitted it with very little support, and 3 years later it was defunct. Smaller, more efficient versions were brought out, have been trialled around the industry, but by more and more other technical problems around cleaning the emissions, then this has been really taken out of circulation. So they're looking, obviously, if there are any financially viable technical solutions that would allow more efficient CHP to work in industries like those, they'd be grasped. But fundamentally, at the moment, there are so many options on the table, and because we don't have the right policies in place, no good investing in something like CHP if you're not going to burn fossil fuels, if it's going to be all electric next year, 5 years down the line. So it's all in flux, unfortunately.
Probably got time for one more question from the floor, if anyone would like to raise their hand. I can see one just in front of me down here. Just the third row down here, please.
Hi, Megan Maguire, Skanska UK. Obviously working in construction, you can appreciate it's very heavily embodied. It's probably a conversation directed for yourself, Seamus. You talk about clients incentivizing reducing carbon, but often when you're involved, it's either design, construction or operation that you're focused on. How do we incentivize either from building or from the customer side, that life cycle approach to reduce across the front. And secondly, offsetting is something that's often seen as quite a negative thing. Heavy materials are kind of different phrasing maybe for it. We're always going to build stuff. There's always going to be something in place. How do we change the conversation of offsetting maybe to be a more positive thing, or is it even needed? Thank you.
Yeah, I think the primary challenge is that upfront, as you say, the carbon, the embodied carbon. So we have what we call a carbon calculator, which actually calculates for every design the upfront carbon and the whole of life carbon. And obviously smart buildings with smart use of power for air conditioning, etc., are a critical part of that. But so I think again it's that holy alliance of client, designer and constructor, all motivated by the same value challenge in terms of low carbon solutions. And then for any particular design, we can come up with a whole of life carbon and an upfront carbon. And then we have those options. But again, the client has to value and has to want those low carbon solutions. And go back to the conversation before, you know, the lower carbon solutions, the more creative solutions will cost more. But if everybody's on the same page and the reward formula is a collaborative formula, that will work. But we have right now, we have the technology, we have the science to, with very great accuracy, calculate whole of life for a building, whole of life carbon solutions. But again, it's just getting everybody engaged in terms of wanting that outcome.
Thank you very much. And on the offsets point, we do have a panel tomorrow focused on carbon markets and offsets. So I hope as many of you as possible can come to focus on that question there. Just about run out of time, so I just want to say a big thank you to the full panel. Really interesting to hear some of the optimism and interest in the decarbonisation agenda, but it clearly is an area where there's a huge amount of challenge as well, particularly at the current time. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Job done.
Well, look, Tom, Seamus, Dave, Isabel and Chris, huge thanks again for that. Just bear with us, folks. We're doing a quick stage reset, swapping over a few microphones, and we're going to be back up and running at 3 o'clock. So not a formal break, but if you want a few moments to stretch your legs, check your emails, be back with us for 3 o'clock. Thanks very much.